Hey everyone, in this video we're going to translate the chapter 22 story from the Ecce Romani textbook. So like I tell you in all these videos, the first thing you have to do is get the vocab under control. It's really hard to read and translate when you don't know what the words mean. So make sure you've read through all the vocab, you've memorized it as best as you can, and you've looked at some derivatives too. So seeing English derivatives will help you associate the meanings with these Latin words, particularly when they're new words. So make sure you've done that, and when you feel comfortable with the vocab, then you want to dive into the grammar. So read through the grammar notes in the textbook, do some practice problems. If you want to watch my chapter 22 grammar video, feel free. Whatever you can do to help yourself feel more comfortable with it, because this chapter does introduce a new bit of grammar, the dative case, which can be a little tricky. So you want to make sure that you've got a solid understanding of what it is before you go too far into reading this story. But once you're ready and you feel comfortable with the vocab and the grammar, you want to dive into the story. Find a partner from class. You want to read the story to them, practice your speaking, and then have them read the story back to you so you can practice your listening. And again, like I always say, you'd be shocked how much you understand just by saying these words out loud and hearing someone read it back to you. You want to make sure that you're activating those parts of your brain too, and not just reading it in your own head. Speak it aloud, bring it to life. It'll help you understand the story. Before we dive in, though, we do want to do a quick review of grammar just so you can understand how I'm going to translate this story for you. So remember, we're dealing with cases here, and a case in Latin tells you how the noun is being used. So things like subjects, direct objects, all this good stuff that we've been seeing so far, those are called cases. The dative case is the new one we're seeing in this chapter. It's the indirect object of the sentence. So if you're thinking of the accusative case, which is the direct object, the dative case is sort of related to it, but we call it an indirect object. It's the person or thing that's receiving the action of the verb, not directly, but indirectly. So we got to look at this to kind of parse this out, because it's a little grammar heavy to hear that description. It really doesn't make a ton of sense until you see it in context. But one thing you can think of is the dative case is most often translated with to or for in English. So here's an example. If you said the boy gave the dog to the girl, if you think about it, you can ask yourself, well, what did the boy give? The boy gave the dog. That's our direct object. So that's the thing in this case that's receiving the action directly, right? The dog is being given, you could say. To the girl is more indirect. So you're not saying what did the boy give, but you're saying who did the boy give the dog to? That's the dative case in Latin. In English, we call this an indirect object. In Latin, the dative case would show this happening, right? And again, notice our translation, to the girl. That's what we're trying to unpack in this chapter. So the dative case is most often used with verbs of giving, showing, or telling. So for instance, you would say, I gave something to someone, right? In the example I just gave you, it was the boy gives the dog to the girl. You could also use it with verbs of telling, right? I told something to someone, or I showed something to someone. Those are the most common uses of it when you see the dative case by itself. But again, when you recognize a noun as being dative, always try to translate it with to or for, and you'll probably get pretty close every time. The other thing you want to keep in mind is the dative and ablative cases oftentimes have the same spelling for their endings. It's not all the time, but more often than not, they look exactly the same. So how can you tell the difference? Well, if the noun is going with a preposition, it has to be ablative case, because think back to our prepositional phrase chapter. The options are only ablative or accusative. Dative does not go with prepositions. So that's one way to tell. When you see a preposition, you know the noun has to be ablative. If there's no preposition, then you have to think a little bit. Usually, if the noun refers to a person, it's probably dative, right? I gave something to someone, probably dative. If there's no preposition and the noun is referring to a thing, it's probably ablative, right? I did something with something is kind of one way to think about it. So it's not a perfect system, but in general, when you see a noun by itself, there's no preposition, and you're not sure if it's dative or ablative, try to think if it's referring to a person or a thing, and that'll get you pretty close. So now that we've got a general understanding of what's going on with dative case, again, you want to read through the textbook, do more practice problems. But now that we've got the general idea of it, I think it's easier to see it in context. So let's take a look at the story, and I'll point out when the dative case shows up. So again, we're going to highlight everything in different colors so that you can see the different cases. Like we've been doing with all these videos, red is nominative, blue will be accusative, green will be genitive, the purple will be the ablative, and the yellow will be the dative. So that's the one we really want to focus in on. Orange is for vocative. And again, that's pretty easy to spot, so I'll just point it out as we go. So the story starts like this. You have Iam dies erat. Now it was day, right? So remember, they've been at the inn the past few chapters. They spent the night. Now it's the following day. And again, notice the imperfect tense of erat. Then you have prima luce, raidarius auxilio servorum cauponis raidam e fossa extrahit et ad cauponam ad movem. So prima luce, here's our ablative. It's showing time. So at first light, prima luce. So at first light, the raidarius, there's our subject, the coachman. And the verb is in the middle. It's an extrahit. It's perfect tense. The coachman dragged, right? What did he drag? He dragged the raidam, there's our direct object, a fossa. So he dragged the carriage out of the ditch. And again, fossa is ablative because you're showing motion out of something. So he dragged the carriage out of the ditch. How did he do this? You have auxilio. So here we have a word that could be either dative or ablative. That O ending, we're not sure. So this is what I was telling you in the grammar. When you see it, not with a preposition, right? Because if it was a preposition, it would have to be ablative. You want to think, am I talking about a person or a thing? Auxilio is a thing. It means help. So the guess would be it's probably ablative, and that's exactly what it is here. It's describing how he dragged the carriage out. How did the coachman get the carriage out of the ditch? Auxilio, with the help, right? Servorum cauponis is telling whose help he got. So it's genitive, you translate it of. So he pulled the carriage out of the ditch with the help, auxilio, of the slaves of the innkeeper. Or you could say of the innkeeper's slaves. So the idea here is Cyrus, the coachman, got help from the other slaves, and he pulls the carriage out of the ditch. So there's a good example looking at auxilio of thinking, is this ablative or dative? Then we continue with et ad cauponam ad moet, and he moved, right? He moved it towards the inn, ad cauponam, right? So in other words, they drag it out of the ditch and they bring it to the inn. Then you have tum servi quistas Corneliorum raidario tradiderant. So then, tum, the servi, there's our subject, the slaves. What did they do? Tradiderant. It's perfect tense. You can tell by the erant ending. They handed over, right? What did they hand over? We need a direct object. Quistas, the trunks. It's accusative plural. So then the slaves, meaning the innkeeper's slaves, handed over the trunks or the chests. Corneliorum. This is genitive plural. Since there's only one Cornelius, when you see the plural form of Cornelius, it means the Corneliuses, the family, right? So the slaves handed over the chests of the Corneliuses, and here we have raidario. Notice the O ending on it. Again, is it dative or is it ablative? There's no prepositional phrase, so we want to think for a minute. What is a raidarius? It's a coachman. It's a person. It's probably dative, and that's what we have here, which is why we have it color-coded in yellow. So in other words, they handed the trunks of the Corneliuses to the coachman, right? It's the indirect object. So try translating it as 2 or 4. In this case, 2 works best. So they gave the chests or handed over the chests to the coachman, meaning to Cyrus. There's your dative case. Then we continue of interea in caupona dum omnes se parabant sextus iam ememor terroris nocturni militis fabulam Cornelii narrabat. So a little bit longer of a sentence, but we can unpack it. Interea means meanwhile. So you have meanwhile in the inn, in caupona. And again, it's ablative because it's a prepositional phrase, just showing position or location. They're inside the inn. So meanwhile, in the inn, while everyone, omnes, all, se parabant, everyone parabant, they were preparing, say, themselves. So while everyone was preparing themselves, sextus, right, here's our subject, and we have a side thought. He's now ememor, forgetful or not remembering is kind of what it means. So forgetful, terroris nocturni is genitive, of the terror, terroris, of the night. So in other words, remember he was afraid in the last chapter that the innkeeper might kill him, right? That's the terroris nocturni they're referencing. So now he's forgetful of the terror of the night, meaning he's not remembering how scared he was. He's doing fine, right? Sextus is back to being. So now we can go to the main verb, right? We have sextus narrabat, he was telling. So iam ememor terroris nocturni really is the side thought. So it's just describing kind of how Sextus is. Now we get the main verb narrabat. So Sextus was telling. What was he telling? The fabulam, the story. Now here we have militis fabulam. Usually you'd flip those, but it's still going with fabulam, the story of the soldier, meaning the one that he heard last night. And then we have Cornelii. Here's the dative case. He was telling it to Cornelia. Now again, the AE on Cornelii could be dative singular. It could be genitive singular. How can you tell? You have to use the context here. Cornelia didn't tell a story in the last chapter, right? The soldier did. So he's telling the story to Cornelia because she didn't hear it. So if you use a little bit of context clues and think about what the sentence is saying, you'll get to the right answer. But this is dative singular. It's first declension, dative singular. He was telling the story of the soldier to Cornelia. Then we have Eucleides, mandata servis dabat. So Eucleides is the subject of our next little piece here. Dabat, he was giving. What was he giving? Mandata, orders. It's neuter plural. He was giving orders. And then we have servis. Again, is it dative or ablative? So think for a minute. There's no prepositional phrase, and it's referring to people, right? Slaves are people. It's dative case, not ablative. He was giving the orders to the slaves, right? So Eucleides is telling the slaves what to do. Cornelius ipse Aureliae et liberis clamava, agite omnes, nolite cessare, tempus est discedere. So Cornelius himself, Cornelius ipse, there's our subject, clamava, he was shouting. Here, again, we have Aureliae et liberis. Aureliae could be either genitive singular, nominative plural, or dative singular, right? The AE ending has a lot of uses in first declension. Just think about what makes the most sense. So does it make sense to say Cornelius was shouting of Aurelia? No, doesn't make any sense. If it was nominative plural, you'd be saying that there's two Aurelias and they're doing something. That doesn't make any sense. There's only one. So dative is the most logical answer here. He was shouting to Aurelia and to the children. Again, liberis with the long is could be either dative or ablative plural, but it's referring to people, children. It's going to be dative. So Cornelius himself was shouting to Aurelia and to the children. He says, agite, come on, everyone, right? Omnes is vocative. It's what he's calling his family. So come on, everyone. Nolite cessare is a negative imperative, right? So it's a command. And the te on nolite means it's plural because he's talking to his family, more than one person. So nolite plus the infinitive is when you're telling more than one person to not do something. So you can translate it as don't. He's saying don't hesitate or delay, right? Don't delay, cessare. And he says tempus est discedere. It's time, tempus est, discedere, to leave, to depart. So he tells everyone, we've got to go. Come on, like don't delay, hurry up. It's time to go. Then we have tandem cuncti e caupona venerant et in ridam ascenderant. So finally, or at last, cuncti, everyone. Cuncti and omnes mean basically the same thing here, right? Everyone or all. Everyone came, venerant, it's perfect tense. They came e caupona, out of the inn. Again, it's ablative because you're showing motion out of something. So they came out of the inn. And ascenderant, perfect tense, they climbed in ridam, into the carriage. So again, it's a good way to remember our prepositional phrases. When it's accusative, ridam, you're going into something, right? Which is why it's accusative here. They're climbing into the carriage. Then you have vale clamaverat pueri. So goodbye, shouted the boys, right? Pueri clamaverat, the boys shouted. Now notice vale doesn't have a te on it. It means they're shouting goodbye to one person. Who are they shouting to? The caupo in the next line. You have valete respondit caupo, qui in via stabat. So vale means goodbye to one person. Valete means goodbye to more than one person. And again, it's because vale is really a command, an imperative. Be well is really what you're saying. So when we have the boys shouting to one person, they say vale, goodbye, to the innkeeper. Then the innkeeper, caupo responded, he responded with valete, goodbye. His is plural because he's referring to the two boys. So goodbye responded the innkeeper, who in via stabat, who was standing in perfect tense in via, in the road. And again, via is ablative because it's just showing position where he's standing. And then he says, nolite in fossam iterum cadere. Again, we have a negative plural imperative, a command. Nolite cadere means don't fall. He says nolite because he's talking to the family, or really the boys, I guess, here. So he's telling them all, don't fall in fossam, into the ditch, iterum, again. Right? So that's his sort of warning or joke to him. He says, don't fall into another ditch, or literally don't fall into the ditch again. Non in omnibus cauponis bene dormire potestis. So the innkeeper says, you all are not able, non potestis, bene dormire, to sleep well. There's your complementary infinitive. So it says, you're not able to sleep well in omnibus cauponis, in all inns. Again, this is his one last pitch to say how great his inn is compared to the rest, even though we know from Aurelia that his inn was actually kind of dirty. Then you have tum ridarius habenas sumsit et equos verberavit. So here we have the then, right, tum, the coachman, Cyrus, habenas sumsit, he picked up the reins and he beat the horses, equos verberavit, meaning he hit them to get them moving. Tandem, romam iterum petebant. So at last, or finally, they were seeking, petebant, Rome, again, Iterum. And again, the real emphasis here is on tandem because they've been stuck in this ditch for a bunch of chapters. They're finally back on the road. Then we continue with in itinerary, sextus omnia de more mortuo Marco explicavit. So on the journey in itinerary, again, it's ablative because it's showing basically position here, just on the journey, right? They're not going to the journey or anything like that. So on the journey, sextus explicavit, he explained, perfect tense. What did he explain? Omnia, everything. Then we have a prepositional phrase, de, which means about. It always goes with an ablative noun. So it's de more mortuo, about the dead mouse. So this is a reference to the side story from the last chapter that hopefully you read in the Ecce textbook, where Sextus has a dream that it turns out to be a dead mouse. So here we have mortuo, and if you're wondering, well, is it mortuo Marco or mortuo more? You just have to think for a minute. Mortuo means dead, so Marcus is not dead in the story, so it wouldn't be dead Marcus. It's the dead mouse. Marco here is another one of these second declension nouns that could be ablative or dative. And if you're trying to figure out which one it is, you want to think about whether it's referencing, again, a person or a thing. Here it's a person, Marcus, it's going to be dative. So you're saying Sextus explained everything about the dead mouse to Marcus, right? He's telling him a story, basically. Then you have Cornelius, militis fabulam uxore narravit. So Cornelius told, narravit, the story, the fabulam militis, the story of the soldier, uxore, to his wife. There's your dative noun. So Sextus told Marcus about the dead mouse. Cornelius told his wife, the story of the soldier, right? He told the story to his wife. Then we have Iam urbi apropinquabat cum subito pueri ingens aedificium conspexerunt. So here you have another dative, urbi. Now this is another thing they explained in the grammar for this chapter. With certain verbs, you're going to see they take a dative noun. Apropinquare is one of those. So when you approach towards something or approach something, you use a dative noun in Latin. So this is saying now they were approaching, apropinquabat, the city. Literally, you could almost say like they were approaching to the city, but easier way to translate it is they were approaching the city. It feels like it should be accusative, but it's not. Apropinquare goes with the dative. That's why you see urbi there, the third declension dative singular. So now they were approaching the city when suddenly, right, and again, here's this sort of interruption action, right? When suddenly the boys, pueri, conspexerunt, they caught sight of. It's perfect tense. You can tell by the X in the middle of it and the erunt ending. So they caught sight of the ingens aedificium, the huge building or a huge building. It's a direct object here. It's a neuter noun, aedificium. So the boys caught sight of a huge building. Marcus patrem, quid est illud rogavit. So Marcus asked, rogavit, again, perfect tense, and he asked his father, his patrem, right? That's your direct object. He says, quid est illud, what is that, right? Meaning, what is that building? Atque sextus, quis in illo aedificio habitat. So, and also, right, Sextus asked is kind of the implication here. So Marcus asked, what is that? And Sextus asked, who, habitat, who lives in illo aedificio, in that building, right? Again, it's ablative because it's inside the building. So then you have cui Cornelius, nemo ibi habitat, cum riso responde. So Cornelius, and you have to go to responds, right? Responded. So he responds to him. Cui here is dative. It's referring back to Sextus, right? It's dative singular. So Cornelius responded or responds to him, meaning to Sextus, again, dative. Cum risu, with a laugh. Remember, cum takes an ablative noun. That's what risu is. It's a fourth declension noun. You'll see that later on, but just think of it as with a laugh, cum risu. And he says, nemo ibi habitat, nobody lives there, right? So he's laughing because you're going to see it's a tomb, right? But he says nobody lives there, and he's laughing at Sextus. And he continues. He says, "Es sepulchrum Massalae Corvini, qui erat orator praeclaros." So he says, it is the tomb, es sepulchrum. Then we have a genitive of Massala Corvinus, right? Who was, qui erat, an orator praeclaros, a famous orator, a famous speaker. Right, so he's telling him this is the tomb of a famous speaker. Hic sunt sepulchra multorum et praeclarorum civium quod Romanis non licet intra urbem sepulchra habere. So he explains what's going on here. So he says it's a tomb, right? So the boys see a giant building on the side of the road, and Cornelius, the dad, is telling him this is a tomb. And he says, hic sunt, here there are, sepulchra, tombs, of many. So we have multorum praeclarorum civium. They're all genitive. So here there are tombs of many distinguished citizens. right? The et, so you could say many and distinguished, but you could just put it together, of many distinguished or many famous citizens, right? So along the Via Appia, what he's referencing is you would see, they're still there today, including these tombs he's mentioning. There's tombs on the side of the road, right? It's almost like an advertisement for your family. You build a giant tomb and all the travelers going by would be able to see the tomb of your family and kind of read about how great your family was. But he explains why. He says there's all these tombs because, quote, Romanis non licet, it is not permitted, non licet, for the Romans. So again, when you have non licet, it goes with a dative noun. It is not permitted for someone to do something, right? So it's not permitted for the Romans, Romanis, dative, habere, to have sepulchra, to have tombs, intra urbem, inside the city. And intra goes with an accusative noun in that prepositional phrase. That's why you have urbem. So he's saying it was not allowed for Romans to have tombs inside the city, right? So they're all outside the city. You would see them on the Via Appia as you were traveling. That's what they're describing here. Mox alterum aedificium magnum viderunt. So soon they saw, perfect tense, viderunt, and it's meaning Marcus and Sextus and Cornelius, right? The family. They saw alterum aedificium magnum, another huge tomb or another big, building, another big building, right? Aedificium. And then we have Marcus rogavit. So Marcus asked, Esne id quoque sepulchrum pater? So Marcus asked, is it, right? Est id. Id here means id, it's neuter, right? We'll learn this a little later. But he says, is it also, quoque, a tomb, father? So he's looking at another giant building. He says, is that also a tomb? Ita vero, Cornelius responded. So yes, right? Truly, Cornelius responds. Est sepulchrum Caecilia Metellae. So it's the tomb of Caecilia Metella. Then he says, nonne de Caecilia Metella audivisti. So he says, surely you've heard, right? Audivisti, you heard about Caecilia Metella. Said Marcus Patri nihil respondet. It says, but Marcus said nothing, or literally responded nothing to his father. There's your dative case, Patri, to his father. Iam enim urbem ipsam videre poterat. So because enim, or since now, poterat, he was able to see, videre, there's our complementary infinitive, he was able to see the city itself, meaning Rome. Ecce Roma clamavit. Look, Rome, he shouted. Ecce Roma, clamaverunt Sextus et Cornelia. So Marcus shouted, look, Rome. Then you have look, Rome, shouted Sextus and Cornelia. So the other two children. And again, clamaverunt and clamavit, they're all perfect tense. So they're shouting, look, I can see Rome. Because at this point in the Via Appia, you would actually be able to see the city of Rome. Tum Cornelius, brevi tempore ad portam capenam ad veniemus, et titum patrum, vestrum, ibi videbimus. So here we have brevi tempore, ablative, it's showing time again, in a short time. Cornelius says, ad veniemus, we will reach. Here we have future tense. It's a hint of what's going to come next chapter, and we'll learn how this, is formed. But for now, just think of it as a vocab term. Ad veniemus and videbimus down below are both future tense. So he says soon, or in a short time, we will reach or will arrive at the Porta Capena. The Porta Capena is one of the gates in the walls of Rome, that southeastern gate that is along the Via Appia. So in other words, the Via Appia would bring you right to the Porta Capena. So he says soon we will reach or arrive at the Porta Capena, and videbimus, we will see Titus, right? And he describes him as patrum vestrum, your uncle. Ibi means there, so meaning there at the Porta Capena, we will see your uncle. Epistulam enim per serva misi, et omnia ei explicavi. So Cornelius, the father, says, since or because, he's explaining why they're going to see Titus there. He says, misi, I sent. There's your perfect tense. I sent a letter, an epistulam, per servum, through a slave, meaning with a slave. Or so in other ways, another way to think of this is he sent a slave with a letter, right? So I sent a letter through a slave, and explicavi, I explained everything, omnia, ei, to him. Ei is our dative noun here, right? Our dative pronoun. He says, I explained everything to him, meaning to Titus. Titus, mox nos prope portam excipiet. So again, excipiet is future tense. Titus is our subject. So he says, soon Titus will welcome excipiet. And again, we'll understand where this comes from next chapter. He says, he will welcome us, nos, prope portam, near the gate. So he's saying your uncle's going to be there, and he's going to welcome us when we get to the gate. Okay, so this is the end of the story. It's introducing a little bit of what you're going to see in the next chapter with future tense here. For now, just think of it more as like vocab terms, and we'll understand how we're forming these and spelling these in the next chapter. But for this video and for this chapter, you want to think about dative case as your main bit of grammar here. How we're using it, how we're translating it, being able to recognize that's really what this chapter is all about. There's a lot of perfect tense mixed in, which is a good review of the past 3 chapters, but otherwise you want to be able to recognize and translate dative case. And again, think about what we said of the rules of recognizing dative case, especially when there's no pronoun, and when you have words like second declension words, which the ending for dative and ablative looks the same. So you just want to think about it and practice it. But like I always say, the more you practice, the more you read, the better off you're going to be with your translations, and you get more comfortable with it as you go. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'll help you however I can. But otherwise, just keep practicing and you should be fine.